Can someone kill 3 people and still not be legally responsible for doing it? So as crazy as that might sound, that's actually the question at the center of the Lindsay Clancy case that is taking place right now. Hi, I'm Veronica. I'm a licensed therapist, and as of today, I'm recording the Lindsay Clancy trial as it is still ongoing. So new testimony, new evidence, and information might come out as this video is being created and posted. Once again, this is educational and discussion content only. It's not legal advice, not a diagnosis, and I'm publicly discussing available information online and this court testimony. You probably hear me use phrases like according to the testimony on purpose because a lot of this is literally being contested and talked about as we speak. Any opinions in this video that I give are based on my own thoughts and the information that is currently available, but like I said, that's changing too. And if you find breakdowns like this helpful, please consider subscribing for more conversations about mental health and discussions like cases like this. So quick trigger warning before we get into all this. This case involves the death of children and a suicide attempt. So if either of those topics is at all heavy for you or a trigger, take this time, focus on yourself, maybe skip this video. And if you are experiencing any immediate emergency, call 911, or if you're struggling with your own mental emergency or crisis, you can call or text 988. So I want to be really mindful about how I talk about this topic because this isn't just some crazy story on the internet. A family has been completely torn apart and 3 beautiful children are no longer in this world, and it is a tragedy. So I want to be as respectful as possible and responsible for how I talk about this and discuss what happened, because I also believe that this case can really raise some important questions about severe mental illness, postpartum mental health, and just overall our healthcare system. And I believe that's worth discussing and educating and talking about on this channel. So right now in this ongoing court case, no one's really debating whether or not Lindsay Clancy has taken the lives of her children. Both sides are agreeing that she did this. The fight right now is over why it happened and what her state of mind was at the time, and whether or not she can be held legally and criminally responsible for what she has done. And what's really interesting is just how much the conversation and talk around this particular case has changed since the trial started. I mean, in the beginning, a lot of the reaction online was basically like, she did it, guilty, end of story, throw away the key. And now, not so much. A lot of things have changed. Like more testimony has come out, evidence and information, and the internet has absolutely taken storm. Just particularly around this case, people are questioning the evidence, picking apart the testimony, recreating situations at home, and doing like their own little forensic experiments. They're coming up with every theory possible, anything you can imagine, to the point where people are questioning even the police investigation and analyzing Patrick's testimony and emotional reactions, debating Lindsay's suicide attempt, and even pointing things out about how Patrick's new wife kind of looks low-key like Lindsay in some aspects. Now, I really believe that some of these questions are worth talking about, and some others kind of go well beyond anything that has particularly been proven in court. And as appealing as it may be and interesting as it is to kind of go down the TikTok rabbit hole, at the end of the day, these are just theories and speculations surrounding this ongoing trial. And I do think that some of these conversations are getting people to look at the evidence differently and ask questions that they may not have had asked before in the beginning, and to stay open-minded to a lot of these possibilities beyond whatever conclusion they came into with at the start of this trial. So since so much of this has unfolded and things have changed, I think it's worth talking and going through what we actually know about what has happened and what has come out through the testimony, what both of these sides are arguing, and the overall public opinion around this case, because it's just shifting and it's all over the place. It's just moving so much. So currently, as we speak, in addition to this main case, there are also 2 separate civil lawsuits that are involving mental health providers that have treated Lindsay before the deaths. Patrick Clancy has filed one and Lindsay Clancy has filed another. So those lawsuits are raising like allegations and questions around things like her diagnosis, the medication management, and all the things that she was given, follow-up attempts, communication between providers, and whether her worsening mental health was actually appropriately recognized and treated effectively. So those allegations have not been proven, and as I said, they are ongoing as we speak, in addition to what is presently taking place right now. So throughout this video, I'm not going to be really focusing on the 2 medical malpractice suits that were just filed, but instead leaning more into the criminal trial that is currently taking place, Commonwealth versus Lindsay Clancy. Currently in this case, there are 2 really different legal questions that are kind of running alongside each other. And that is, was Lindsay Clancy criminally responsible for killing her children? And separately, were there failures in the medical health care that she received prior to reaching that point? So after looking at what has actually been coming out in this trial, I think that it's a hell of a lot more complicated than some of the headlines that you see, or like the 30-second shorts that you get on your social media and even the comments online. It's more complex than it may seem. So what actually happened? Lindsay was a labor and delivery nurse living in Duxbury, Massachusetts with her husband, Patrick Clancy, and their 3 children. Cora, age 5, Dawson, age 3, and Callan, 8 months old. So in the months after Callan's birth, Lindsay began receiving treatment for worsening health symptoms, some of which include like anxiety, depression, severe problem sleeping, insomnia, suicidal thoughts, intrusive thoughts. And according to Patrick's testimony, some of those intrusive thoughts involved fears and thoughts about harming the children. Now, in this time period, Lindsay saw multiple mental health providers and was prescribed multiple psychiatric medications. And eventually, she voluntarily admitted herself into McLean Hospital on January 1st, 2023, where she stayed for about 5 days. She was later discharged on January 5th and continued receiving outpatient psychiatric treatment. In fact, she even had like a virtual appointment with her psychiatrist the day before the deaths had happened. And then, unfortunately, on January 24th, 2023, while Patrick left the house to pick up some medication and some takeout, while he was gone, Lindsay had gone ahead and killed all 3 children using a exercise-resistant band. Then she attempted to take her own life by jumping from a 2nd-story window, which has now left her paralyzed from the waist down. Tragically, Cora and Dawson died that night, and Callan was taken to the hospital and unfortunately passed away several days later. So that's kind of what happened, and it's incredibly heartbreaking, just the reality of what unfolded. And now we were all sitting and watching the aftermath in the court proceedings. Currently, the defense is not disputing if Lindsay had taken the lives of her 3 kids. They are, in fact, saying that she did kill them. The question that is currently up for debate now is what was happening in her mind when she was doing it, and whether or not she is criminally responsible for those actions. And this is kind of where the criminal trial and those civil lawsuits that I had mentioned earlier start to overlap, because now we're looking backwards at all of the months leading up to the deaths and asking like a much bigger set of questions. Like, what was happening in Lindsay's mental health? What treatment was she receiving? How much information were the providers sharing with each other? What medications were she given? And like, was the seriousness of what was happening to her being recognized by others? We're hearing a lot of different testimonies about the psychiatric symptoms, her calls for help, the hospitalization, medication changes, emergency care, and all of the different clinicians that have had an active hand in her case. And now we're all piecing all this information together after the fact. And all of that information matters for both sides of the story because it paints a much fuller picture, especially when we're asking questions like what Lindsay's mental health state was at the time of her killing the children. And it also plays a role in asking ourselves the question of whether or not the healthcare system around her has recognized how badly she was deteriorating and if they responded appropriately. And this is where like these cases start to overlap more and more, and it gets more complicated. So that's kind of where we stand right now. One of the things that I wanted to go over in this video is what actually postpartum psychosis is and also what bipolar is. Because I want to be really clear. I've seen a lot of things on the internet saying that postpartum psychosis isn't even real and it was invented particularly for this case. That is not true. That is not true. Postpartum psychosis is a documented serious psychiatric condition. And according to the NHS, which is the National Health Service, it can affect roughly 1 in every 1,000 women after childbirth. And it is very different compared to when we talk about baby blues. Now, baby blues can take place after a woman has her baby, and it leads them feeling like emotional, tearful, anxious, irritable, maybe some mood swings in the days after having her baby. And typically it can go away by itself pretty quickly. Postpartum psychosis, on the other hand, is an entirely different story on a different level. It can involve hallucinations, delusions, mania, severe confusion, depression, agitation, insomnia, and just rapid mood swings all around. And then on top of that, there's bipolar disorder. Now, bipolar disorder is a separate mental health condition altogether, involving significant changes in mood, including episodes of severe depression or periods of what is called mania or hypomania. Now, mania can involve things like a person feeling extremely irritable. A lot of times people experience things like racing thoughts, agitation. A person might experience unusually high energy or feeling like elevated, like they're on top of the world. And that a lot of times will be accompanied by a decreased need for sleep, with that impulsivity outside of someone's normal behavior taking place. So once again, these are not the same conditions, and it's important to also mention that there is a connection between all of them. People with bipolar disorder are at a higher risk of developing postpartum psychosis after childbirth. So when you hear bipolar disorder and postpartum psychosis kind of being discussed together in this particular case, they're not just two random diagnoses being thrown around. There's actually an established clinical relationship between these two disorders before this case even started. According to the NHS, postpartum psychosis usually begins suddenly within the first few hours after someone gives birth to the first 2 weeks. In rare cases, sometimes it can begin like several weeks later. And in extremely rare situations, it might begin a couple months later. So Callan was already 8 months old when he had died. So naturally, I'm wondering, like, how does the timeline kind of fit here? And so I don't want to fill in the gaps myself or oversimplify like what the defense is arguing in this case. But their position isn't simply that, like, hey, she had a baby and that 8 months earlier she had postpartum psychosis and then it all led to this. What her attorneys are actually arguing is that, like, Lindsay was suffering from postpartum psychosis and then bipolar disorder kind of mashed on top, and then her psychiatric condition that had already been deteriorating over time just kind of took head. And on top of that, some of the medications that were prescribed may have worsened the underlying bipolar condition. And despite her best efforts of getting help, she experienced a psychotic episode that led to the deaths of all her children. And so that's what they're arguing here. But here's what's important distinction in all of this is that even if the defense convinces the jury that, like, Lindsay was severely mentally ill, that alone does not mean that Lindsay wasn't legally responsible for what she had done. So having postpartum psychosis and bipolar disorder or depression and anxiety, or any mental health condition or diagnosis, mind you, that does not automatically mean you have a get out of jail free card. So before we start looking at the evidence that the prosecution and the defense are fighting over here, we need to understand what they are actually trying to prove in this case. So what does not criminally responsible actually mean? Under Massachusetts law, the question is, did a mental disease or defect leave someone without substantial capacity to understand what they were doing was wrong, or have the ability to control their actions at the time of a killing? So you can have depression and still be criminally responsible. You can have bipolar disorder and still be criminally responsible. A person can even be experiencing psychotic symptoms, and the legal question would still be, what did those symptoms actually do to your ability to understand and control your actions in that specific moment. That's why a clinical diagnosis and legal determination of criminal responsibility are two different things. And once you understand that, you can start to see just why the prosecution and the defense are looking at the same exact evidence situation and they're coming to two completely different conclusions. There's one more important thing that I wanted to mention that I think is important to understand before we get into looking at the different arguments. And that is Lindsay doesn't have to prove that she lacked criminal responsibility. Once that issue is kind of raised in the Commonwealth, they have to prove it. The burden of proof is on them. So they have to show that beyond a reasonable doubt, she was criminally responsible at the time of the killings in that moment. So what Lindsay's attorney is doing is raising questions. He's calling upon providers. He's bringing out their medical records and pointing out all the medications that she was on and all these other details, because each one of these things doesn't have to prove that she had postpartum psychosis by itself. It just needs to create doubt. He's using all these pieces to challenge the prosecution's version of the story that she knew what she was doing and she did it anyway. So once again, the defense doesn't need a perfect explanation for everything. The question is whether the Commonwealth has proven criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. And judging by the way people are reacting online to the testimony and the information that's coming out, a lot of the public seems to have more questions now than they did when this whole thing started. So now let's flip it. What's the prosecution actually arguing in this situation? Well, their position is yes, Lindsay was struggling with her mental health, but she knew what she was doing. They pointed out a lot of different evidence showing that she was planning the situation, including how she sent Patrick out of the house before the killings. Prosecutors argue that this can create a window of time when she was alone with the children and supports their position of the story, that her actions were intentional rather than a result of someone completely losing their minds and being disconnected from reality. They've also relied on testimony from the clinicians who treated Lindsay in the weeks and days leading up to the deaths. Several of those providers testified that they did not observe any signs of psychosis or mania, and that Lindsay did not tell them that she had a plan or any intention of killing any of her children, let alone herself. So from the prosecution's perspective, Lindsay may have absolutely been mentally ill, but mental illness does not automatically mean that she lacks criminal responsibility. Another example where both the prosecution and the defendant side are telling two different stories is revolving around Lindsay's suicide attempt. So during the testimony, the prosecution brought out that Lindsay's cuts on her wrists and her neck were described as being superficial. And when you hear that word, your brain kind of paints a picture in your mind where it's it's minor, surface level, shallow cuts, not life-threatening. Kind of implying that it may have been staged. But then Lindsay's lawyer pushed back on that, pointing out that the cuts were only one part of the attempt, that Lindsay also jumped from a second-story window and suffered multiple injuries, including a spinal fractures, severe damage that left her paralyzed, a fractured rib, and a slew of other injuries. So when she arrived at the ER, while her body temperature was reported 82.1, she was also severely hypothermic. So her lawyers kind of questioned whether or not the extreme cold could have impacted the blood flow and how the wounds looked at the time she was evaluated by the medical professionals. And while hypothermia can explain a lack of heavy bleeding, it also gives the defense another way to challenge the word superficial. So with that being said, they're saying regardless of how deep the cuts were, someone did still jump from a second-story window and left themselves permanently damaged and incapable of walking. And it also kind of says regardless of how deep the cuts were, she did try to kill herself a different way. And then all that goes back to reasonable doubt. The defense isn't only challenging how the events that night are being interpreted. They're also looking backwards at Lindsay's entire medical treatment history and also asking what was happening the weeks leading up and the months leading up to these deaths. And instead of looking at individual appointments and saying, well, this provider didn't see the psychosis, the defense stance has been looking at the entire timeline, her symptoms, the medication she was prescribed, all the medication changes she experienced, the emergency care, hospitalizations, calls for help. And they're looking at how that information was being passed between all the different providers treating her. And they're saying, well, did anybody even have the whole picture? Because the testimony has raised a lot of questions about how much different providers know about what's happening outside of their own in particular appointments. One provider testified that she never directly spoke with Lindsay's other psychiatric providers, and she didn't have records from any of the other facilities that were involved in her treatment. So now you start having one clinician that knows one piece of information and another provider that knows something else, and then another provider that's managing medication, and then another person that's evaluating her in an emergency setting. And potentially, like, nobody's seeing all these pieces together because nobody's talking. And as a therapist, that's kind of where my ears perk up a little bit. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that automatically all of these providers have committed malpractice or have caused what happened. Again, that's part of a larger series of questions that are being asked in those separate civil lawsuits that I had mentioned earlier on. And those are ongoing and still allegations that have yet to be proven. But hindsight is powerful. We're now sitting here knowing the outcome of everything. And the clinicians that were treating Lindsay at the time beforehand didn't really have the benefit of knowing what was going to happen. I do believe that this case, it raises a lot of very real questions about fragmented mental health care and what happens when someone is moving between multiple providers and trying to navigate the medical system in addition to their condition possibly getting worse over time. And I want to also share some background information about providers that I really think a lot of people don't realize. Providers and clinicians can't just pick up the phone and get every record they want at the snap of the fingers. We can't force another facility to respond to our emails. Just like with the patients and their experiences, we are also working within a broken system ourselves. And as clinicians, we have the ethical responsibility to try to do no harm. We assess risk. We recommend higher levels of care when it's needed. We coordinate the care when it's appropriate. And we also take emergency action when somebody meets the legal and clinical threshold for it. But I also can say, like, if you're an outpatient provider, you can't force treatment on every person who's struggling. We generally can't force someone to take their medication either. We can't make other doctors' offices send us the notes and records. And so a lot of the information that we're working with comes directly from what the client reports to us, what they choose to share and what they don't, along with any other information that we're legally able to obtain during that time period. Someone can be depressed and anxious and having intrusive thoughts, barely sleeping, and still, yeah, they're not doing well, but they don't necessarily meet the threshold for an involuntary hospitalization in that particular moment. And a coordination of care isn't as simple as people think either. You can have different health systems, different electronic records that need to be sent, different privacy rules and organizational policies, and all these situations where additional authorization or an ROI might be needed. And so, like, even when a provider is actively trying to coordinate care, that doesn't mean that the provider or the facility immediately will respond, or sometimes they don't respond at all. And it's incredibly frustrating for the provider. So now that everyone's looking at Lindsay's records as a whole and they're asking, well, why didn't this person know this? And why didn't this provider have this record? And why weren't all of these people talking to each other? Those are absolutely fair questions. But I think we also have to understand that the system clinicians are actually working inside of is limited, and we can only do what we can do. So we can document concerns and recommend different courses of treatment, coordinate with care, and encourage someone to go to the hospital and take emergency action, of course, when the situation is appropriate for that. But we also have confidentiality laws. There's ethics, privacy rules, client rights, and that we have to legally follow. We can't just share whatever we want with another provider just because we want to and we think that it would be helpful. There are rules around what information can be shared, and there are certain records and situations where a client's authorization matters. If we violate those privacy requirements, there can be real professional and legal consequences for us providers who are doing that. So yes, we're functioning within a broken system. We're doing what we can. So even if you're doing everything by the book, the system still is broken. Additionally, as a provider, I'm speaking for myself here. I don't have a magic crystal ball that tells me all this information. We can only go by what a client decides to disclose and actually tell us in session. If someone minimizes symptoms, leaves something out, doesn't disclose what's happening, it can completely change the picture that we're working with. And even when providers are trying to coordinate care and information and get records, like, it doesn't move quickly or as smoothly as people would think. So once again, like, providers are definitely working in a fragmented system, but we're working with what we have once again. One thing that the Lindsay Clancy case also has made me really think about as a therapist is something that we don't talk enough about, which is how fear of liability can actually change the way that providers are practicing. So during this trial, we've literally watched an attorney dissect Lindsay Clancy's medical records down to individual words and even so much as a placement of a comma. And that really stood out to me because one punctuation mark can really change how somebody else interprets a sentence. Now, was that actually what the provider meant? Was it a typo? Was it written quickly between patients? Was this a sentence that was just poorly worded? Or does that comma actually change clinical meaning in the note? And here's the thing. Medical records are incredibly important. And one of their core purposes is that continuity of care. So if someone puts it down, someone else can pick it up. They help providers remember not only what happened in sessions, but they also track symptoms, how a client is progressing on their goals. They document risk, clinical decisions, and they communicate important information about someone's medical treatment. But now we're also seeing how those notes and records can be pulled apart years later in courtrooms. And providers are human. Like, typos happen. Dictation makes mistakes. Templates make mistakes. AI-assisted documentation can make mistakes. So sometimes, like, a sentence makes perfect sense to the person that's writing it in the moment, but it reads completely different to somebody looking at it years down the line with all this information, and they're dissecting it. So that doesn't necessarily mean documentation shouldn't be taken seriously. If anything, the Lindsay Clancy case is just another reminder of how careful providers need to be when writing their notes. But I also think that there's another side to all of this that really worries me. And that is when clinicians watch another provider's documentation get ripped apart word by word. Yeah, when that happens, it can be just as serious because now more providers are afraid about liability. They're afraid, is someone going to beat me over the head with a note 5 years down the line? And that fear changes behavior, not only in how a person writes the note, but how they're engaging with their clients. Some clinicians might become more hesitant to accept clients with severe symptoms like suicidality or complicated diagnoses, individual presenting with a higher level of risk because they're thinking, like, what if something bad happens? What happens to my license? Will I be able to still make a living? What if my notes end up in a courtroom? What if I put the comma in the wrong spot? And unfortunately, that can make it even harder for people who need the most help to actually find someone who's willing to treat them, because providers can overcorrect in the opposite direction. Providers may become so afraid of being accused of not doing enough that every risk assessment now takes 3 times as long. Every statement gets clarified in multiple different ways. Every possibility gets documented. Every comment is now scrutinized, and the sessions start to become more scripted. Practitioners might even start to prioritize practicing defensively and prioritizing liability protection and referring people to higher levels of care sooner, even if the situation may have otherwise been okay being handled in an outpatient setting, and that would be something that the client is more comfortable with. So instead of the provider's entire focus being on like, hey, what does this person need from me right now? How can I be present with them? Now part of their brain is thinking, well, how's this going to look 5 years from now? How's this going to look in their chart? What if an attorney reads this 3 years from now? Did I document enough to protect my client? Did I document enough to protect me? And whether the provider wants to admit it or not, like they're going to really be asking themselves these questions. And there is always going to be some level of risk when you work with human beings who are struggling. Mental health providers cannot predict the future with 100% accuracy. We cannot assess all levels of risk and know 100% of the time what the outcome will be. We can only document, we can only consult, we can only coordinate care when we can, and we can recommend higher levels of treatment when we can. We can definitely take emergency action when it's warranted, but we cannot guarantee that nothing terrible will ever happen if you get help or if you go to a therapist or a psychiatrist. And honestly, I really don't want one of the biggest lessons that providers end up taking away from the Lindsay Clancy case to be, don't trust complicated, high-risk individuals. Don't take them on your caseload. I think a better question would be, how do we protect patients and still hold providers to appropriate standards without making clinicians feel afraid of liability? How do we create a support system for high-risk individuals so that care is more accessible and that care teams have clearer lines of communication? Now, with that all said, I wanted to go back into Lindsay's case specifically because while her provider's testimony raised a lot of these bigger questions about the medical system, there are also a lot of pieces of evidence in this case that are kind of hard to interpret and a little odd. So depending on how you look at them, they can support completely different narratives, but I still wanted to include them in this video. 4 days before the killings, investigators testify that Lindsay's phone was used to search, can you treat a sociopath? I'm not gonna lie, I kind of thought that was interesting. It definitely made me stop for a second, but I don't think that we can take one Google search alone and turn that into like a psychiatric evaluation or build an entire murder case theory investigation on that search alone. But yeah, because immediately from that, I just have a lot of questions like, why is that being searched? Who was the person that you were thinking about when you searched it? Was Lindsay worried about herself? Was she researching about somebody else in her home life? Was it based off of something she watched on TV? Like, what prompted this question? And I mean, the search can tell us like it was typed into a phone, but it also doesn't tell us like who typed it into it and what the actual meaning behind it was. The fact of the matter is that yes, it did come from Lindsay's phone, but it doesn't necessarily tell us who searched for it. And that's exactly where the internet has stepped in and started filling in the blanks for themselves. You know, there are people that are theorizing that maybe the sociopath search wasn't about Lindsay at all. Like, they're theorizing that maybe it was all about Patrick. People are picking apart his testimony, his demeanor, the timing of him leaving the house, and little details that they are theorizing don't add up. Some people are even questioning whether law enforcement investigated other possibilities thoroughly enough. I've even seen some people comment online saying he didn't cry, so he did it. Or analyzing just how he's reacting when he's talking about certain things. Personally, I don't put a lot of weight on that. Men and women grieve differently. There is no correct way to look when grieving. Somebody can be crying and that doesn't necessarily prove that they're innocent, and somebody can be crying and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're guilty either. So yeah, over the course of this court case, people are starting to stack all of these little things together. And some of the odd things too, like he left right before the killings happened in the house. And they're saying, well, in the footage of him, why is he changing things like his shoes and jacket just before going out or while he's out? And then it becomes, well, what about this detail? And what about this thing that happened? And how does this fit in the timeline? And suddenly now the conversation is shifting to, are these things just coincidences that feel significant because 1,000 people are picking apart this family's every second of their life leading up to this moment? Or are these legitimate patterns that actually deserve more scrutiny and a closer investigation? And I think it's okay to ask these questions, but there's also an important difference between noticing something that seems strange and also deciding that you already know what happened and you're in the comment section saying he's guilty or he's innocent or vice versa for Lindsay. That being said, Patrick's whereabouts during the killings have been supported by surveillance footage and video evidence saying that he was not at home. So that has to be a part of the conversation too. With that said, that still hasn't stopped the internet from running rampant with all of these different theories. I mean, some of them have gotten pretty dang elaborate if you ask me. And I think we have to draw a line between questioning the evidence and creating answers when we don't actually have them. When we say something like, oh, this feels weird to me and this is odd, like that's not the same as someone having legitimate evidence and proof that another person has committed a crime. And looking at something, eventually more things can come out of that and change how we understand the case. Who knows? Like, being open to following the evidence goes to find truth is so important. But I'm also not comfortable jumping on the bandwagon to be like, oh yeah, that seems weird, that's sus, and that makes Patrick a murderer. That doesn't make sense either. I think we have to follow with the evidence that's being presented to thoroughly establish what truth happened here. Another interesting spin I wanted to bring up is I've seen people post online that Lindsay's a nurse and she would know how to kill herself if she really wanted to. And I understand why people have that thought. But if the defense was right and she was legitimately experiencing some form of psychosis or some kind of psychiatric disturbance in her mind, then I don't know we can assume that her actions would have actually looked logical and organized or medically informed just because she was a nurse. We can't argue that someone may have been profoundly mentally unwell and unstable at the exact time and expect every decision that they made to follow perfect, rational logic and sense, even if she was a nurse. And honestly, I think that's what stinks about this whole entire case is that, like, the public, everybody wants certainty, and we want one explanation where everything's really detailed and clicks into place and we can finally all say, oh, we know exactly what happened. And sometimes we can get that, and then other times we don't. This may always be one of those pieces of those cases that it feels strange and confusing and just unanswered. And that being uncomfortable with that uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean that we fill in the blanks and gaps with whatever theory that we feel is most convincing at the moment. And I really think that uncertainty is becoming a big theme throughout this entire case. Like, it's incredibly gray. There are pieces of evidence that look so damning to Lindsay's case. And I mean, there's also providers that have testified that said they didn't see any psychosis or mania when they were working with her. But then again, you got to also look at all the other pieces that make up this case. And so you're looking back over the months leading up to the killings, and it really makes someone ask themselves, like, how is a person that is interacting with so many different parts of this medical mental health system, how can they still deteriorate this badly? And I want to point out, like, tragedies can still happen even when you're working and actively getting help with a therapist or a psychiatrist. Like, that's what makes this case so difficult. There might not be one piece of evidence that suddenly makes every question disappear. And ultimately, the jury has to sit with all of this conflicting pieces and decide whether the Commonwealth has actually met its burden of proof. So where do I personally land with all of this? Well, I mean, the more that I've looked into this case, the less comfortable I am with some of the extremes that I've seen people take online. On one side, you have people saying that she's evil and she needs to be locked up forever and buried under the jail, and that mental illness is not an excuse. And then on the other side, you have people saying, like, she was severely mentally ill and the system just failed her, so technically she's not responsible to that way. And I don't really stand with either one of these sides because I don't think it's that simple. Because the fact of the matter is, like, 3 children are dead. Their father came home to something that no parent should ever have to come home to or experience. Their mother killed them and then attempted to take her own life. Like, that is an unimaginable tragedy. But we also can't just ignore everything that was happening in the months leading up to it as well. Like, Lindsay was literally trying to get help and was actively receiving treatment and reporting some serious health symptoms and going through all of the medication changes and the steps, trying to get higher levels of care. And ultimately, she even voluntarily hospitalized herself at some point. So all of that matters too. Acknowledging that she may have been severely mentally ill does not erase what happened to Cora, Dawson, and Callan. But acknowledging what happened to these children also doesn't mean that we should pretend her mental health wasn't a major contributing factor in this case. And ultimately, thankfully, I don't have to be the one to decide whether or not Lindsay is criminally responsible. Neither do you, neither does TikTok or the comment section on your phone. Only the jury gets to decide. And that question they have to answer isn't simply, did she kill her kids, but instead, beyond a reasonable doubt, was she of sound mind when she did kill them? And after everything we talked about, I can really understand why that question has become more complicated for people than maybe it seemed at the very beginning of this entire trial. So in closing, whatever this jury ultimately decides, Cora, Dawson, and Callan don't get to come back. Nothing we learn by looking backward through these records is ever going to change that fact. But if we're going to go through every medical record, every appointment, every medication, every call for help that she made, and every decision that was made leading up to this tragedy, then I also think we should be asking, what can we learn from it? Not necessarily who we can blame, but if anything, could we do better? How can we make it easier for providers to communicate? How can we support families who know that someone that they love is falling apart? How do we make women's health and their mental health, their physical health, a greater priority than what it is now? And how do we recognize severe postpartum mental health conditions sooner? What ways can we support clinicians who treat high-risk patients? And how do we make it easier for people to actually get the help that they need before something reaches a breaking point and there's no coming back from it? Let's prevent these tragedies, because we can't change what happened to this family, but we can learn from it. We can look where the gaps were, where communication may have broken down, and what could have been improved so that people in crisis have a better chance of getting the right help at the right time. So I'm curious, after hearing more of the evidence and testimony that has been presented thus far in this case, what are your thoughts? Has your opinion changed at all from the beginning of the trial to compared to now? Feel free to comment below if you want. And just a reminder, this isn't some story that we're watching online. These are real people. This is someone's actual life right now. So even if you completely disagree with me or disagree with someone else in the comments, please keep it respectful. And if you want more conversations like this around mental health and the complicated gray areas that come with things like this, please feel free to like, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.